Next is Isaiah Greene. Isaiah is a colleague of mine at Slack. He works on a team that we call Search, Learning, and Intelligence. And he's going to share with us one project that he worked on, which focused on helping users understand which of their messages were the most important. So in particular, one of the feedback we get at Slack is that some people feel overwhelmed with the amount of messages. So Isaiah is working on solving that problem. Isaiah.
Thank you. Cool. So like Jules said, I'm Isaiah, and I work at Slack on our Search, Learning, and Intelligence team in New York City. We're a group of about 15 folks with backgrounds in information retrieval, machine learning, amongst a few other things. But really quick before I start, just curious so I know how far to go. How many people in here know what Slack is and use it regularly at work? That is amazing. Glad to see it. All right, cool. So one cool thing you might not have known is that Slack actually has a pretty cool backronym, which is the searchable log of all communication and knowledge, which is cool because that means that our team has a word in this backronym, which is searchable. And that's awesome. So basically, our team, one of our big roles is to help people like you make the best use of the entire archive of messages that you have in Slack, or messages, files, and other things. So this entire collective knowledge of your team, we want to bring the power of that to you in much, much easier ways. And also, like Jules said, our team has primarily been focused on tackling the problem of information overload. So this is not a problem that Slack created. So for example, if you used email before, maybe you oversubscribed yourself to too many things or just received too many emails. I saw a lot of product managers in the room. I'm sure that's been true for you at some point in life. But Slack also has this issue where folks feel overloaded by information. So we thought this was a good opportunity to use machine learning to try and distill some of that information and help people get back to their best work and most creative work. So today I'm going to talk about one specific feature that we launched called Highlights earlier this year. How many people have heard or used have heard of or used Highlights before? Okay, less exciting than how many people use Slack, and that's fine because after today you'll all know about it. So I'm going to talk about this from more of a product perspective in terms of what problems we are facing. And what challenges we saw. I'll talk a bit about the process of getting there. So again, our main problem is to tackle information overload. And this is a problem that gets worse for people the larger a company is, right? So for larger enterprises, the more likely it is that you oversubscribe to too many channels and have too many unread messages. And we want to help people focus on what's most important first and help them catch up quickly if they've inevitably fallen behind. So the big thing here, we kind of focused on two use cases. One is PMs like us who are in meetings all day. Maybe you've got a small hour or 30-minute slot in between all the meetings you're going to. Maybe that's the time that you check Slack. So you go to a meeting, you come back, you go to a meeting, and you check Slack. And when you're there, you've got all these unread messages. How can we help you quickly catch up on what's there? And the second use case is things like paid time off or vacation. So let's say you were gone for 2 weeks at a time, and you came back, and you just want to not even think about looking at your computer. As a matter of fact, a lot of people just mark everything red and say, I am filing bankruptcy on this, and I will move on, and that is it. But for those people, we also want to give them a way to quickly catch up on what's important in Slack. So our solution is a product called Highlights. And really quickly, just to talk about kind of our real-world analogy for how we think of this, we want Slack and we want the intelligent features in Slack to be sort of like a chief of staff for every single person who uses Slack. So if you think of like famous chiefs of staff for different presidents, they have kind of three main things they need to do a good job at helping the president out. The first is that they have to know all of what the president knows. They have to have the full context of what the president is doing so that they can help them out, right? We're in a good position to do that because, like many of you have raised your hands for, Slack is a place where people are doing a lot of their work. So there are things that we can know there. The second part that the chief of staff has to do well is kind of know what the important things are. So if the president comes out and, of course, is very busy and says, hey, what are the 3 things that I should be thinking about right now before I go off and do this other important thing? The chief of staff has to be able to say, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and nothing else. So they need to be able to distill all of that information and give only the relevant and important things back. And the third thing the chief of staff needs to do is know when to interrupt, right? So you've all had maybe noisy chat clients before that are pinging you all too often. This chief of staff, you've probably seen a president giving a speech and someone comes and taps them on the shoulder and kind of whispers in their ear and goes, oh, this is really important, that building's on fire, we should probably go. That's what we also expect Slack and intelligent features to do. So how did this manifest itself in Slack? In a product called Highlights. So Highlights helps people catch up quickly on its unread messages across all joined channels, basically by grouping them into a single dedicated section. So there's one slide that shows a GIF here. And so this is your all-in-reds view in Slack. So regardless of how many channels you're in, all-in-reds is a single streamlined view that has all of your unread messages. And what we've done is added a section to the top of that that'll take up to 10 messages that we believe are most important and relevant for you. To do that, we built a personalized model. And now I'll get to talking about some of the challenges with our model. One is that there's no real clear way that we know that a message is important to you. So to do that, we actually use message engagement as a proxy. So we look at the likelihood that you'll engage with one of these messages, whether you're clicking a link or reacting to it or replying to it. Those are the engagements that we're trying to predict in knowing and thinking that that is a message that is more important to you, right? So that's the basics of our model. And we, as a team, so far have definitely biased toward much more simple models that we think can get this job done. And so far, it's doing a pretty good job. Some other challenges here, some other things here. We rely on some of our other models here. So we've also built models around understanding how important a channel itself is to you. So we have a user channel affinity model that where we basically try to predict how likely you are to star a channel. And how that showed up here is in the ordering of the messages or the ordering in which we choose to take messages from a particular channel. So we're more likely to show you a message from a more important channel than we are from one that you don't check often or that you even have muted, for example. So before I move on, any questions about this particular solution as this GIF is played a few times? Yes, it's a good question. So there was the success of our model itself and how well we thought it was performing. And to do that, we actually we did something called a dark test or dark launch, which some of you might be familiar with, where we launched everything about the feature except for the front end of it. And actually, there's another part of this. As it's clicking in here, you can see that in the channel itself, we also highlight the message. So basically, in this dark launch, we highlighted all of the messages that we normally would without showing someone something in the front end, and we actually just measured how likely they were to click that message. And we did this kind of in a three-way, experiment where we had one model that we called our naive model that pretty much chose messages at random, and versus our other models, and looked at how much better we did than those, basically. So that was how we kind of measured success of our model, and we outperformed it significantly. Otherwise, a few of our other goals were to look at how likely someone is to let their messages pile up over time now that they have this feature, things like that. Or what are the other ones? The other ones are, so we didn't want to, for example, decrease the amount of time that you would read an important message, an important channel. That's still fine. So for the most part, we measured how well we thought our model was performing, and then for other things, we just we looked at sort of your channel switching behavior and how likely you were to read these channels or have engaged reads, as we call them. Cool. There's another question I thought.
You have like a stream of conversations instead of just like one like standalone message. So like, do you take that into consideration at all?
Yeah, that's another one of our big challenges is right now we would love to identify conversations in terms of like when they start and when they end. We don't currently do that, and that was and is still a challenge of ours.
In these highlights, do you take into consideration, say, certain people whom you interact with more rather than channels, and
100%.
show their...
I'm so glad you asked that. So yes, this is a personalized model. So if there are people who you interact with much more, people who we've identified as your teammates, and they react on a message or reply to a message, that's seen as much, much more important to our model than someone who you've never met before. So again, this is powered by a few different things on the personalization side. The user channel affinity, but also user affinity. And at the top of each highlighted message, you'll see that we have these justifications that say, Jacqueline shared this message in this channel, and we order the names of people who are in that justification based on their affinity to you. So you can tell right away that I'm showing this to you because your teammate who sits right there reacted to it in this other channel. Great question, thanks, because I would have forgotten.
Have you guys seen any issues with like seeing the names of contributions? Like you're showing stuff that they've been clicking in the past, and so more likely to click on items. But what if something new happens?
Not necessarily. I guess the biggest issues that we saw around that are things like just biasing too heavily toward images, for example, which we don't necessarily at this point know what's in them, but people are they're images, so they're more likely to click them. So that sort of, in a way, is like what you're talking about. But at this stage, no, like in All in Reds itself, we haven't really seen that be an issue. But that brings up another good point. We also added the ability to add positive and negative feedback. And if you click the negative feedback, you're able to choose like why this was not good for you. And you can say things like, show me less messages from this channel. That was like not the right, I don't want to hear anything from there. Or show me less messages from this person, right? So if we messed up in those ways. So interest of time, I'm going to move on. So I chose one big challenge. And again, this is a little bit more of a product and process challenge than it is a technical challenge. Basically, we had an internal launch that we ended up having to pivot from. This internal launch, we had just a much, much more kind of prominent UI for highlights that at the time, launching something in an internal dog food and having it be potentially distracting to people who were working caused like kind of an internal issue for us as we're like getting feedback. Our main goal was to make sure we got as much feedback on our model as possible. So what did we do about this? This is actually before we had the section at the top of All in Reds. This is when we only had in-channel highlights, which were aimed at helping you in that 2-week vacation case. What we did was we built the second half of this, which was the All in Reds view, and we combined the two launches and made it slightly more less prominent so that it matched sort of where we felt we were with our model so far. So the key takeaway that I learned here was that the prominence in the UI of what you're using your model to do should match sort of the confidence in the stage that you're at with your model. And luckily, we learned this internally, right, which was actually part of what we wanted to do anyway, was kind of get it out there, really kind of step all over the world, add crazy stuff everywhere so we get this, get people to see this and start giving us the feedback we need to make improvements. So during that time that we launched it, we brought it back, made a lot of model improvements, added another piece to the launch, combined them in logical ways that still made sense to serve our use case, and relaunched it and had a much, much more successful launch. And the outcome, just to give, I guess, a little bit of color on like the difficulty of the problem. So on average, without highlights or anything like that, users interact with 0.5% of the messages. So 1 out of 200 messages will get one of these engagements. And that's what we're trying to predict. So I was here going to talk a bit about that dark test that we did to learn that our model was better than some quote unquote naive model. And since then, machine learning has allowed us to double the predictive capability just about every quarter since we've launched this. So machine learning definitely proved to be useful for this problem. Cool. Any other questions? We're good with time or? Cool, moving on, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah.